it tried to reflect a change in power shift in the world, and how Brazil should position itself. So in terms of foreign policy, Brics, especially in the Dilma government, I don't know if you discussed this over these days, but in the Dilma administration, actually, the Brics initiatives was very central to Brazilian foreign policy. I would say it even superseded policy orientation towards South American integration in terms of foreign policy. It gained a centrality, even stronger and greater than the priority given to South American integration. Now, so it's clearly anti-hegemonic rationale. It's not a revolutionary rationale, it's a reformist rationale in the international system, but it's anti-hegemonic. The general trend that it pointed to in terms of foreign policy orientation and strategic formulation was that Brazil should diversify its international relations, politically and economically. And that multipolarization was a fact in the world, and that Brazil could gain greater strategic autonomy, strengthening positioning itself within the trends that led the world to greater multipolarization. That was the general strategic formulation in foreign policy. And that reflected also significant, profound, and fast changes in the international system and in international political economy. So if you get from in the Cold War period, post-Cold War period. So in 1992, this is a figure which, it's in Portuguese, I'm sorry, but what does it capture? It tries to capture participation in world GDP in purchasing power parity terms, not US dollar terms, but purchasing power parity terms. So here, I don't have South Africa, I'm sorry. I have a colleague from South Africa here, but we could place more 1%, and then South Africa would give you the figure. But Brics countries represented in 1992 something like 14.5% of world GDP measured in purchasing power parity terms. This is 92. This situation in 2017, Brics countries represented in 2017 more than 33%, more than a third of world GDP measured in terms of purchasing power parity. That's a very significant change in 25 years. It's a quarter of a century. The main countries responsible for that change were China and India. Within Brics, China and India. If you go back, China represented 3.5 of world GDP in 1992, 19.3 in 2017. India, 3.1 in 1992, 7.8 in 2017. So of those 33%, China and India were responsible for 27% of that change. I mean, 20% of the Brics participation in world GDP. That's something, I mean, whoever studied the Brics countries' development closer, even when the Brics initiatives was at its utmost strength. There was clearly two speeds in terms of economic development within the Brics countries, and clearly China and India on a faster development and economic growth track, and Russia, Brazil, and South Africa in a very, very much more modest economic development and economic growth track. That is a major structural change in terms of global power shift in IPE. Of course, from my bio, you see, I mean, No academic is neutral. I'm not neutral. But I mean, I've had, besides my academic positions, I've had government positions. So, of course, my speech here is not neutral. It comes from a certain perspective, and it's critical of the present reorientation that is being conducted in Brazilian foreign policy. But what is the basis of the reorientation? Very clearly, there's an option for realigning Brazil in terms of its foreign policy ideologically with, it's not even with the US, it's with the Trump administration in the US. So that's an important difference. It's with the Trump administration within the US. Our present foreign policy minister, he was selected to be foreign policy minister due to the impact of an article he wrote for IESP, which is a Brazilian journal linked to the Ministry of Foreign Relations, in which basically he stated that Brazil is a Western country defined by its Christian identity. Western civilization is in decadence ever since the French Revolution. That's in his article. Yeah. Because the impact of the French Revolution on Western societies has led to increasing self-doubt and self-negation and opening up to other ideological influences, and that Trump plays today the role of the savior of Western civilization. And now you imagine in a country with the characteristics of Brazil, the size of Brazil, the role Brazil has played in international politics, globally, regionally, having a foreign policy minister whose strategic orientation is that Trump is the savior of the Western civilization, which has been conducted into decadence by the impact of the French Revolution. What type of foreign policy formulation can be built upon this theoretical, ideological basis? Now, the question is, the issue is that it's not only a discourse. It's a discourse which the government has tried to translate into foreign policy initiatives, such as, maybe for Brazilians here, it's very common talk, it's known, but maybe from our colleagues from abroad, they follow less closely our political debates in Brazil. But first of all, option for aligning with the Trump administration in interference in the Venezuelan crisis. This is a very important question for us and for Brics, because on the issue of the crisis in Venezuela, there's a very clear counterpoint between the US, China, and Russia with respect to the crisis in Venezuela. And the policy orientation that was formulated was to align with the Trump administration and defend all initiatives for promoting regime change in Venezuela, including the possibility of military action. And that was made a central point of foreign policy, of Brazilian foreign policy in the new government, based on the Foreign Relations Ministry's position. But it faced very staunch opposition from the Defense Ministry in Brazil. If you remember, right before taking office, the president-elect announced that he would admit the setting up a U.S. Brazilian military, denied that possibility at the time. And in the escalation of the crisis in Venezuela all the way to the attempted regime change in February, there was a clear opposition on the part of the Brazilian armed forces to the orientation that came out of the foreign ministry with respect to the crisis in Venezuela, and also because there are very close and ongoing contacts and relations between the Brazilian military and the Venezuelan military. So this was a central issue in foreign policy, where there was a foreign policy formulation, but it was unable to be taken to its ultimate consequences due to opposition, internal opposition, in this case, staunch opposition coming from the Ministry of Defense and the Brazilian Armed Forces. The second initiative, which was announced, involved the following Trump's agenda, international agenda, once again, the transfer of Brazilian embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That was announced. Netanyahu came to the inauguration here in Brazil. That decision was restated. The question, if you remember the president's comment, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. That's he said, now we are going to change move Brazilian embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and everyone knows everything that's involved in that. Once again, was staunch opposition to that initiative in different sectors of Brazilian society. First, above all, from the agricultural business sector, which has in Muslim countries a very important export market, and they moved to neutralize the announced decision. So it had to be scaled down, and there were also there was also opposition coming from the Ministry of Defense and the Armed Forces for security reasons, that there could be a security threat associated to that change in Brazil, and putting Brazil in the conflict instead of being a more embracive country in terms of the conflict, and a staunch defender of negotiated settlements for the crisis in the region. And that announcement had to be scaled down. So he scaled down to a business representation in Jerusalem, and things are kind of frozen. Another foreign policy initiative which was announced and had to be scaled down, it involves, once again, Brics, not directly, but indirectly, but was the position of the Brazilian government with respect to China specifically. Because as a candidate, if you remember, he visited Taiwan and announced the visit. If you see the pictures, I went back to read the news. He visited Taiwan. He's an official candidate, already in the condition of a candidate, a pre-candidate, because the campaign hadn't started yet. But he was a pre-candidate. He had announced that he would run as candidate for president officially, and he visited Taiwan. Today it's kind of together with his three sons. Including Eduardo Bolsonaro, which has now indicated that will be his candidate for Brazilian ambassador in the U.S. And so he visited with his three sons. And that had an immediate response from the Chinese side. Taiwan was one of the first countries to congratulate him for his victory in the elections. There was incremental in terms of anti-Chinese rhetoric on the part of the government. But once again, in office, that had to be scaled down. Although announced and reinforced, but in terms of concrete positioning, he had to scale down that rhetoric, anti-Chinese rhetoric. So in what I think we're seeing, that's my interpretation, because I was going to have a dialogue here with Oliver, because I saw his abstract. His abstract said that nothing had changed, or basically nothing had changed, or very few. I don't want to be he said that Brics grouping is no longer seen as a product of an ideological choice, but rather part of a natural adaptation to a more Asia-centric world on the part of Brazilian foreign policy. I don't know if I agree with that. I think in terms of foreign policy formulation, there were major changes. And because the Brics initiative, as an anti-hegemonic strategic initiative, is no longer a central part of Brazilian foreign policy. What, as I mentioned before, predominates is an alignment with the Trump administration as a centerpiece of foreign policy orientation. So clearly that weakens the centrality or priority given to the Brics initiative within the present government's foreign policy. I would say that even in the previous Temer government, after Dilma's administration, Brics came down 2 steps in terms of the ladder of priorities in foreign policy. It was basically seen as an umbrella to develop and strengthen Brazil-China relations. I think that was the basic approach. In the present government, I would say it came down another 4 steps. Okay. And it's still a foreign policy agenda, but to a great degree emptied in its strategic, in terms of the strategic orientation which predominated in the creation of the Brics initiative. And what it seems that, it was scaled down, and there are attempts to maintain bilateral relations with China. Specifically, there was the structuring opening of the COSBAN, which is a high-level negotiation body between Brazil and China. So the relations with China are still being cultivated, despite the anti-Chinese rhetoric, which was formulated by our main foreign policy dignitaries. And let me put this. I think this. I don't know if you can see that. This kind of. I think this points to the reasons why. It's where this ideological reformulation of Brazilian foreign policy enters into contradiction with consolidated economic interests in the country. China, since 2009, has become our main trade partner. This basically shows our main 5 main trading partners in the world and the size of the trade. So clearly China has a very central part. Today represents twice our exports to the U.S. Of course, we can discuss the content of those exports. They're not high technological exports. They're basically commodities and agricultural goods. That's a very central point to understand why it's difficult to take an anti-Chinese rhetoric to its ultimate consequences. And from a political economy perspective, this is an interesting graph, which are the main destinies of exports from different states in Brazil. And clearly you have an absolute predominance of exports to China, where Bolsonaro's electoral strength was very strong. South, center, west. Maybe for our colleagues from abroad, you can't understand the political economy that's involved in this, but for Brazilians it's clear. You have a major interest in maintaining favorable trade relations with China in very important electoral basis of Bolsonaro's election, in the presidential election. Eh?
Not in the north.
Yeah, in the northeast last year, exactly. So there's a contradiction, isn't it? Yeah, it's a contradiction here in terms of, northeast is where Bolsonaro didn't win, was defeated in elections. In conclusion, basically, my argument is that the foreign policy reorientation that has been announced and started to be enacted by the present government does not correspond to broad Brazilian national interests in the context of the power shift that is in place in the world. It connects us to a power which is losing positions in the world. And in terms of our international economic presence, in a number of areas is a competitor with Brazil. Of course, you can say that, well, that places us still in a level of competition with commodities, commodity-dependent exports. That's true. So I would say that the present government, if it maintains its ideological foreign policy orientation, and it has done so in terms of trying to consolidate a very radicalized, ultra-right political base in the country, it is very difficult to maintain that in terms of broader national interests which exist in the country and which tend to dilute or neutralize that ideological foreign policy orientation that the government has enacted. That's my understanding. So it's not that there hasn't been a change. There has been a change. But that change has a number of very important obstacles in terms of its consolidating, internal political consolidation. I don't know if I'm being clear. So and this is the last point I would like to say. This is polemical, but because our present government and our present president many times is compared to populist, rightist leaders in the world, in Turkey, in Hungary, Poland, Italy, Liga do Norte, or Trump in the US. But I think there's one big difference. Like all these other right-wing, authoritarian, populist leaders are nationalists. Well, at least they're critical of German influence in the European Union, German hegemony. They place themselves as an alternative to German hegemony in the European Union. In our case, we have a president with a nationalist rhetoric, but enacting an ultra-liberal economic policy which is basically anti-national. So I think which I think makes his social and political base more fragile from my perspective. I think he will face, maybe that's too optimistic. I'm trying to respond to my grandson's picture. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but I think he will face major challenges and difficulties in consolidating a broad social and economic base in the country due to the anti-national consequences of the policies that he's enacting, both in economic terms and in terms of ideological formulation of Brazilian foreign policy priorities. Thank you. I'm sorry.